I think what really, with the Civil War and Reconstruction, it's really a period or era, and to speak to my own personal likings, I think it's a very interesting era in terms of resistance. I think a lot of people have this false notion that during or in the time of Black history, especially before the Civil Rights Movement, or especially um, before the Emancipation Proclamation, that Black people or enslaved peoples were not actively revolting or not actively resisting against their enslavers or their oppressors, which is not very much the case. As we know and as we discussed last week when it comes to Black history, is that Black history tends to be hidden, or tends to be covered in a way in which is more convenient to those who tell that history. So if you want to, for example, for those who sought to, like we were talking about before when we were talking about chattelization, animalization, all that things like that, if you as a country or as a institution want to prop up the institution of slavery, or you want to make it seem like a net good, then you're going to essentially say, well, you know, people were not resisting to slavery because it's something that they were fine with, which is obviously not the case. There's a common misconception, not even a misconception, it is I would very much say a intentional rhetoric that people who were enslaved were fine with slavery, which was not very much the case. Slavery, as we discussed last week, was a system of not only family separation and violence, but it was also a system in which people were owned for their entire life. They did not own themselves. They had no right to self-determination, etc. So as we go on to the Civil War and Reconstruction, it's incredibly important that we then talk about what is the response. Excuse me, sorry for that bicycle. It's incredibly important that we talk about what's the response to slavery. What's the response to those who are being enslaved? What's the response to the system of slavery? And yes, as you may or may not know, there are individuals within the system of slavery, or within the United States, who were freed. It was more common for those who lived in the North to be freed. However, there were freedmen who were living in the South, etc., etc. But we'll kind of talk about it later, and we'll also really talk about this next week. But being a freed Black person in the United States, especially during the era of slavery, was yes, you were not under slavery, you did have those privileges. However, it was very easy to find yourself enslaved once again, and very easy to see yourself being enslaved for a multitude of different reasons. So let's go on to our slides here, as we're trying to hit that 40-minute mark, and I don't want to talk too much. All right. So let's talk about reframing and talking about the differences between the North and the South. And as you see, we have some states listed, and we have some states listed in the middle or unaffiliated, which we'll actually talk about how exactly they were affiliated. But the difference between the North and South is obviously geographical. It's usually the North and South is cut off at the Mason-Dixon line, which is around the Maryland, Virginia area. However, with the North and South, it also was a cultural response, not only to how the regions or how that state was fueled by, or what that state economy was fueled. So, for example, the South would usually be considered as agrarian, or say less modernized in its economy. So the North was always associated, as we kind of discussed last week, with, especially towards the Industrial Revolution, factory production and other means, or the kind of like the backside of agricultural labor, or the shipping and production of the actual agricultural labor created by the South. And the South, as we kind of talked about before, was the agricultural powerhouse. This is as you may be familiar with, the home of King Cotton and other cash crops such as rice, tobacco, etc. But what we really also need to go over is that, the South also implies, not only geographic situation, but it also implies, as we go on to, especially when we go on to the Three-Fifths Compromise, especially when we get closer to the Civil War, it's also for a political situation. When Southern states feel as if they are being outnumbered by free states or by states that are more likely to support what we would call federalism, and we'll discuss the definitions between federalism and confederalism after this. There is a feeling from the Southern states, especially what we call the Old Dominion, specifically Virginia, and this goes back all the way to the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation, that they're being ganged up on. They're being ganged up on by states that would not support slavery, and therefore they're not being properly supported within the federalist system of the United States. Which, to quickly define, federalism is essentially a system in which you have a centralized, not exactly centralized, but you have a central federal government. So that's the current system that we're living in now. So a federal government, like we said, we have a federal government that represents every single state or has power over every single state. So, for example, our White House, which has executive power over, the entire country, or, our judicial branch, our Supreme Court, which has judicial power over every single, not every single country, every single state and every single territory, and therefore presides over and is more powerful than the other lower ranking courts. Or for example, our legislative branch, which obviously our California State Senate is not more powerful than our actual Senate. So when we look at federalism now, of course, that's the system that we live under. But before the Constitution was written and before the United States was established as a federal republic or a federal democratic republic, what we really saw a system in which, especially Southern states, specifically Virginia, the Old Dominion, were advocating for a confederal or Confederate type system. Now, of course, that might ring, some bells in your head about Confederate. Is that very similar to what we would know in the Civil War, known as the Confederate States of America? And yes, that is correct. The Confederate States of America, or a Confederacy, or to define a Confederate system, is where essentially, imagine we were living in the United States, and instead of the federal government having overwhelming power or having more power than the state governments or sharing power with state government, a Confederate system is basically where the states have all the powers besides maybe the ability to coin money, which actually during the Articles of Confederation, a lot of the Southern states were arguing that they should be able to have their own currency. So basically, a Confederacy is kind of, in a way, it's kind of chaotic. You have different states doing different things. When you think of a confederacy, the best way to describe it is, in a way, it's kind of the way, not exactly, but imagine if the United States was set up like the European Union, essentially. Imagine if, instead of being, a United States, we were just basically a bunch of different countries that happen to have a less powerful central government at its head that barely had any power whatsoever. So essentially, a confederacy, if we had a confederacy, or if the Confederacy had won the Civil War, would essentially be, a system in which the states have almost, if not all, the power. But there's still some type of very powerless unifying body at the head, essentially. So when we go into the North and South divide, of course, as you may have read already, the North also would include Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. Rhode Island was technically a part of the North, but politically during the Civil War, Rhode Island would be very divided as a state. And for the most part, you would see that Rhode Island was supported in some fashion, supported the Union in some fashion. However, there were definitely some defectors to the Confederacy in Rhode Island. And mainly, it's very odd historically as to why that happens. Rhode Island, specifically that area of Rhode Island, is known for being very politically mixed, especially during this time. Even though most Quaker settlements were in Philadelphia, there was a large Quaker population which tended to lean more, or not tended to, leaned heavily towards the Union. However, you did have some more conservative figures outside in other religious groups in Rhode Island. What you'll also see is Massachusetts, as well as New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. Now, those last couple states, as you may or may not know, those last couple states specifically, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota, really came into the Union and was really associated with the North because these were new territories being declared as states. And we'll go on to the next slide, but with the map that I'll provide you, this is also a time especially between the eras of 1800 to 1865, where we're seeing rapidly either territorial acquisition, we're seeing the United States start to really implement its doctrine of manifest destiny. And to explain manifest destiny, it was basically a doctrine mainly provided by those who are more hawkish or more ready for war, essentially, in which they wanted to expand the United States from its original 13 colonies on the eastern coast of the United States all the way west to California. And by the time the Civil War starts, California had become a state within the Union, and as we get on later into history, the United States really starts to push the issue of manifest destiny of not only going from coast to coast, but also starts to put its hands into other territories, specifically the Pacific Islands, such as Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, multiple different territories that we see, as well as getting involved with other Caribbean islands, such as Cuba, and that's the reason why we have Guantanamo Bay as well. But to separate, this is kind of the era in which the United States is actively acquiring new territories and states. So that's why the North and South divide is not exactly, this is exactly the northeastern United States and southeastern United States, because the North technically also included California during this time. As you can see there, the North also included western states like California and Oregon. Now, a lot of you, as we go over the South also implies geographic, like I said, that geographic situation, but it more includes Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and the Carolinas. Now, there are a couple of states that are a bit unique, in which, yes, eventually during the Civil War, they do choose what we would call a side in the situation, but are, because of cultural reasons and because of geographical reasons, they're a little strange, and they don't really fit into the exact definitions of North or South. So the first one is Delaware. Now, Delaware was one of the 13 colonies. But Delaware, the reason why we would put this into one of the others was because Delaware was not only was politically diverse, in which there were a large amount of political opinions going on there, but it was also a situation where Delaware, as you may or may not know, was called the Constitution State. And there were definitely discussions within Delaware when the Constitution was written if a confederacy or a federal republic was preferred. And if you guys don't know, the main conflict, or how I like to attribute the cause of the Civil War, because there's a lot of different assumptions, or a lot of different, how should I say, this is the reason why the Civil War happened. I will tell you my interpretation, or what I believe to happen due to my own historical research of why the Civil War happened. The Civil War happened, it was sparked by the issue of slavery, and it was also sparked by the issue of the United States not being able to decide between a Confederate system or a Federalist system. Yes, the United States already had a federal system for the last almost 60 to 100 years. However, the issue was the South was disgruntled by that, and the South was disgruntled mainly because with a federalist system, they were not able to uphold the institution of slavery as well as they wanted to. If they were in a Confederate system where the states had all the power, for example, Virginia, which was a slave state, could very much say, well, the states have all the power. We're in a Confederate system. Therefore, the federal government can't tell us anything about holding slaves. However, because there were so many states and territories starting to be assumed into the union, and a lot of these states and territories, for example, Missouri and Iowa, were very much discussed over if they should be slave or free states. That became an issue. It became an issue because the federal government started to get involved and saying, well, this state is a free state and this state is a slave state. And to many Southerners, and especially to what we would now know as the Confederacy, they believed that the federal government was getting too involved into the matters of slavery. So even though you may hear others say, well, the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was just about states' rights. Well, I always say this. It was about the states' rights to decide whether slavery was legal or illegal. So yes, it is about states' rights. However, it is about the states' rights to enslave or to not enslave people. So, like I said, it's both states' rights and slavery. Then I would really say that when we come to other states, Maryland has always been a very interesting state within United States history. One, as you may or may not know, the United States was founded as a Protestant nation. It is founded, there were a couple different Protestant groups. Like I was saying before, in Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, you would see Quakers, if you're not familiar, or known as the Religious Society of Friends, were a pacifist group of Christians who who have descendants from the Anabaptist tradition. So technically they are a branch of Baptists or Anabaptists, but their main feature is that they're pacifist. And then, of course, you would have the Southern Baptists in the South, and then you would have you would have, Dutch Reformed groups, you would have Presbyterians, you would even have what we would call Puritans, which are essentially Dutch Reformed, and you would have many other different Protestant groups. However, Maryland was interesting because Maryland was the first Catholic majority state in the Union, and Maryland was always more conservative. However, Maryland did not mesh well with the rest of the United States, which was Protestant. So Maryland was always kind of like the weird stepchild of the state, in which they never really got along because they were Protestant. But also Maryland, like I said before, the main ethnic group with the United States, besides Black Americans, were what we would call white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, which are Protestant individuals, usually from Britain or usually descending from British or German groups. But what we saw within Maryland is not only did we see Catholics, but we saw Spanish Catholics, those from Spain, those from Portugal really settle in Maryland as well. So Maryland was always very culturally did not find similarity with a lot of different groups in America. Next, we'll talk about Missouri, which Missouri was one of those states that became a part of the United States earlier into the 1800s as a part of territorial acquisition and the United States moving westward, and was really one of those what we would call battleground states, where it was, is this state going to be a free state or is it going to be a slave state? Same thing with Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia is a little different, but Kentucky and Tennessee was, like I said, one of those two states that got admitted earlier into the 1800s, and it was a question of how do we balance this politically between free states and slave states. Lastly is Virginia, which, as we discussed, Virginia, slavery was very much a common practice and legal practice in Virginia. However, because of its geographical positioning and it kind of being right on that Mason-Dixon line, Virginia was also kind of a situation where, yes, you did have a large proponent, or you had a large group of people supporting the Confederacy, but you also had a decently large amount of people supporting the Union. So as how I would describe it as we go on to this map here, the closer that you get to that Mason-Dixon line, which is on the border between Virginia and North Carolina, is kind of the more you would see that, not specifically Confederate support or not specifically Union support. And to kind of explain the key of this map, red is supporters of the Republican Party at that time, and the Republican Party represented the Union or the North of that time. So as you could see, it represents mainly the geographical northeastern United States, but it also includes what we now know as the Midwest and the Western or the Pacific Northwest as well. And then you also have some states that are also in the blue, which are from the Northern Democratic Party. And after I explain this map, we'll talk about the parties and how exactly those parties actually differentiate from today's parties, because you're seeing Republican and Democrat, and you're very much probably a bit confused of, what's going on, what are these still the same parties that we know today? And in a short answer, no, they're not. So you'll see the blue. The blue was the Northern Democratic Party. So during this time, the Northern Democratic Party would have been Northern representatives or Northern supporters of the Confederacy. So this includes, like I said, Missouri, which was also kind of in that kind of weird situation where they were, they were being admitted as a state, and there was conversations over them being a free state or a slave state. And then next, you also have, Delaware that may also be in that blue. And then you also have parts of New Jersey as well. But you also see the green, which is a Southern Democratic Party. Now, especially during next week's and even the week after that lesson, the term Southern Democrat is going to be brought up a lot. So I want to define it here and now. The Southern Democrat Party is not the same as the current Democratic Party of the United States. The Southern Democrat Party, and the reason why it's historically called the Southern Democratic Party, is because the Southern Democratic Party was a party representing the ideals of the working class Southern citizen. It was a party that was heavily agricultural. Its main base was usually working class agricultural people, usually white people of that time, and it was heavily supportive of slavery. Now, the reason why I try to make the distinction that the Southern Democratic Party and the Democratic Party of today are not the same party is, one, in the 1960s, there was a thing called the party switch, where traditionally, and obviously this is more the case, for Black Americans who could vote, because as we know, there are multiple obstacles put against Black Americans to vote, especially in the South, specifically the grandfather clause and literacy tests and things like that. However, Black Americans, if they could vote or were allowed to vote, on average voted for the Republican Party, which, if you're familiar with politics, that may seem a little backwards, because as we know now, almost by 90%, most Black Americans today vote for the Democratic Party. However, in the 1960s, there was something called the party switch, in which essentially the Southern Democrats, and these were, like I said, these are all Democrats from the South in the 1960s. For example, someone like Jamie Wooden, and we'll talk about Jamie Wooden next week, but Jamie Wooden, others who were in that Southern Democratic camp, this is all the way in 1960, all transferred their party membership to the Republican Party because by that time they believed that the Republican Party better aligned with their views. So what we're seeing now of the Republican Party and the Southern Democratic Party are not representative of our current parties. They're two different ideologies, and they really are the only similarities that they carry to their current parties is the name only. That's really the only similarities that they carry. So going back to the Southern Democratic Party, like I said, this is a group of mainly not really wealthy agricultural they're a group of people or a party who is trying to represent farmers, labor workers, typically white labor workers in the South. However, they also do represent rich slave owners and rich plantation owners in the South as well. The Republican Party at this time really represents the northern constituency, essentially. They're representing those who are not working in agriculture, but are working what we would call, or what we would call now, those essentially white collar jobs, to simplify it. Those who are working in factories, those who are working in other industries that are not, hands-on labor, essentially. And then, like I said, the Northern Democratic Party is just basically the Southern Democratic Party for people in the North who kind of agreed more with the institution of slavery, if I'm being honest. So next we're going to talk about the Civil War, its betrayal in education, and the beginning of a new era of violence. And we set this with our previous class, but I want to further kind of beat that interpretation in a very, in a very visual way of the reason why we have this class is because the teaching of Black history is so varied throughout the United States. I grew up, as some of you may know, I grew up in California. I grew up in Los Angeles County, to be specific. And the way that the Civil War was taught to me was that it was called the Civil War. In places such as California and, in a multitude of different places, for the most part in the United States, it's called the Civil War. However, in certain school districts in not only the South, but you might also see in certain school districts in Idaho and sometimes maybe Montana, the Civil War is called the War of Northern Aggression. Now, obviously, there's a big difference between calling the Civil War and the War of Northern Aggression. The Civil War is obviously more balanced. It says that these are two sides that were willingly going against each other. The War of Northern Aggression basically says that it was the North's fault for essentially what many Southern textbooks and what many Southern education would basically say that the North was trying to go after the South for no reason, which was not the case. And then next, when we talk about the Civil War and Reconstruction, we really have to, and I'm not actually going to touch I'm not going to touch on the battles of the Civil War because yes, it is relevant to Black history, and we will talk about some figures. However, it's what happens before and after the Civil War that is more important to Black history. Sorry about that. That is more important to Black history, and I want us to really talk about because yes, we can talk about the battles of the Civil War and what happened, and yes, there were multiple Black Americans who were involved, as we talked about last week, Harriet Tubman, who was not only a spy, but also a medic during the Civil War, and there were Black American or African American units specifically during the Civil War who really made strides for the North of the Union during the Civil War. And if it wasn't for those units, we might be in a situation in which the South would have won, and we would have been in two different countries. However, the issue more is that before the Civil War, the legal status of Black Americans, when I say legal status, Black Americans or enslaved people at this time, even freed Black people, were not considered citizens. And that was a question within itself. And then you had those who were free or runaway slaves, and the Supreme Court, especially in the case of the Dred Scott issue, were basically required or starting to be required to make decisions of what do we do with freed Black Americans or what do we do with runaway enslaved people. And that is what really set really, in my opinion, the conflict of the Civil War on fire. And then after the Civil War, there's a period in United States history called Reconstruction. And it's called Reconstruction because after the Civil War, not only was the South absolutely decimated by war itself, however, the South had made itself bankrupt. The reason why the South was so confident going into the Civil War was because they truly thought that their ability to produce cotton, rice, all those crops that were called king or cash crops was going to be able to financially support them through the war and after the war. However, what we saw was without the North's factory processing and without the North being able to ship and import their goods, they were left in a situation in which economically, and this still lasts to this day, in which the South was not able to economically recover. So the South after the Civil War, and this was already a case before, but the South after the Civil War became extremely economically desperate. It became, and I don't want to use the word poor, but there were not that many financial options in the South. There were not that many jobs outside of agricultural labor, and that did not produce as much money as it used to before the Civil War. So, after this period, and after Lincoln had sent down troops to the South to make sure that slavery actively wasn't being practiced. And we'll talk about how slavery has evolved after, because some of you may not be aware and some of you may be aware. However, the practice of slavery with Black Americans, despite the Emancipation Proclamation and despite the freeing of some slaves via military intervention, does not exactly stop. It continues, but it continues in very covert and very different ways. But when we talk about this new era of violence, this Reconstruction, basically the South trying to rebuild itself after the war, economically and also from an infrastructure point, the South essentially plunges itself into violence. The South, as I spoke to last week, the time after 1865, I would say the periods between 1865 and 1910 are probably the bloodiest part of Black American history. And it's not because there was some type of internal war happening between Black Americans, but the time between 1865 and 1910, this Reconstruction period, as we know it as now, there were groups like the Ku Klux Klan who had been established. There were actively and openly racist, or sometimes covertly racist, members of Southern governments who were actively trying to reinstill a system of slavery. And there were also individuals who had formerly served in the Confederates, on the Confederate side, who personally believed that they were not going to listen to the results of the Civil War and that they were going to continue to inflict violence and even in some cases slavery against Black Americans during this time. So before we really go on to describing Reconstruction, we have to talk about, like I said, Black people were resisting to slavery as soon as slavery essentially was established in the United States, as any person would. I don't think there is any person on this earth, or there is any group of people on this earth who would not be comfortable, who would be comfortable in the situation in which they're being owned for their entire life and forced to work. And if they resist to that system, they're being beaten or they're having other violent measures taken against them. So in the case of Nat Turner, who you may be familiar with, Nat Turner was someone who he described himself, and as many theologians describe himself, he was filled with the Spirit. And Nat Turner was not only a revolutionary, but he was an enslaved man. And one day, as he accounts, and we'll talk about this kind of confession of Nat Turner, as he accounts before this whole situation happens, he accounts that the Lord spoke to him. And he essentially accounted for that the Lord spoke to him in order to free himself, as well as others who were enslaved on this plantation, specifically three other individuals, to essentially free themselves from the shackles of slavery. So, before Nat Turner, there had been slave revolts, and I wanted to give a little time to talk about this. Like I said, it's still Black American history class. However, we would not be enriched truly in this class without talking about the Haitian Revolution as well. And to give a short history on the Haitian Revolution, Haiti, which had also been a slave colony in the Caribbean, and Haiti, if you don't know, is on the island of Hispaniola. So there are two countries on Hispaniola. There is the Dominican Republic, and there's Haiti. And Haiti was mainly an island of sugar plantations. And during this time, the French, who were using Haiti as a colony, had actively encountered a situation in which there was a slave rebellion / slave revolt that was led mainly by Toussaint Louverture. And Toussaint Louverture was not only a leader, but he was a formerly enslaved person himself. And through his efforts, Haiti had established itself as not only the first independent nation in the Caribbean, but also the first independent nation established by Black people in the New World. So what we would see is there were already tensions within the United States because people were scared, especially slave owners. They were scared that, well, there is this country down not so far from where we're at that of a bunch of enslaved people that decided to essentially revolt against their captors and establish their own country. And the fear was that eventually enslaved people in the United States would do the same. And what really contributed to that fear was Nat Turner. So going back to Nat Turner was not only an enslaved person, but like I said before, he believed that God spoke to him and said that he needed to free himself. And so as a result of what he believed, who had spoke to him, Nat Turner then, with the help or the assistance of 3 other enslaved people, had planned a revolt or rebellion in which he, in the state of Virginia, not only on the plantation he was forced to work on, but as well as the town of Southampton, Virginia, killed / slayed or slaughtered 55 European Americans. And of course, that really heightened the fear that was already caused by the Haitian Revolution. Not only did Americans see, oh, there's another group of Black people, or there's another group of people who are actively revolting and actually establish their own country, now they're seeing it happen at home, actually. Now they're seeing literally 4 enslaved people who barely had any access to weapons kill essentially 55 other people. And what we're seeing is that fear of a slave revolt or a slave rebellion is starting to be fed. Not only is it the Haitian Revolution, but it's the United States, in which we're seeing that whether it be more bloody or violent revolutions like Nat Turner, or, for example, other ways in which enslaved people used to revolt were sometimes they would either refuse to work, or sometimes they would do they would do their assigned tasks so in such an, I don't want to use the word incompetent, but purposely incompetent manner as a method of rebellion or revolt. So we're seeing this happen around the early 1800s to late 1700s. And this fear of there's going to be self-determination within African or Black people during this time is really starting to jump up. And Nat Turner really increases that. And the reason why I have titled The Confessions of Nat Turner, Leader of the Late Insurrection of Southampton, Virginia, is because Nat Turner, the way we found out that Nat Turner believed that God spoke to him was not, well, yes, was through his own words. However, there was a lawyer who came in to account for or talk or basically transcribe what Nat Turner had experienced. And this lawyer, and we'll talk about this during Black literature, but we have to be very careful about discussing or reading this literature, because it's very possible that the accounts of Nat Turner could have been falsified or could have been essentially edited to make him seem more violent or to make him seem more radical than what he was. So we have to be very careful about that historical record. But the next thing that we also look at is the brutality that Nat Turner was met with. And of course, in a society like this, especially during this time, the law was an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. However, the hanging and essentially the execution of Nat Turner was made a spectacle because they wanted to send a message to other enslaved people that revolution of any format, whether it be as violent as Nat Turner or whether it be as non-violent as what other enslaved people were doing, was not acceptable. So what they did is not only did they hang him, but, and I'm going to warn you now, this is quite violent, but they cut off his skin and they turned his skin into grease. And this is a practice that we would see with a lot of rebelling slaves, whether they have killed someone or whether it be another situation. But now we have to go on to the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. Now, the reason why this publication is so important, especially going up to and after the Civil War, was not only did you have the fear of Black people revolting, but with Frederick Douglass, you had the fear especially of people starting to humanize enslaved people or starting to humanize black people. Because before this, Frederick Douglass, of course, was not the first enslaved person to come out with a narrative, but he has the most to this day popular narrative as someone who was formerly enslaved. And Frederick Douglass, to explain slightly, Frederick Douglass was not only an enslaved person, but he was actually the product of an enslaved woman and her enslaver or her master, or her slave master. And when Frederick Douglass came out with this account of his not only him being enslaved, but also his escape from slavery, what we also saw was people who are not enslaved, or even European Americans or white Americans at this time, were starting to wake up to the brutalities of slavery. They were seeing that not only was there people being owned for life, they were seeing situations in which enslaved, specifically women, were forced to have children with enslavers, and they were seeing that, and a lot of people are starting to come around to the situation, or starting to really come around to the thought that slavery was not morally okay. And this, combined with the fires of the Civil War already being fed, had really led to a very chaotic time in America. And not only with the Nat Turner Rebellion, but you also had non-black people also doing very similar rebellions. You have people like John Brown, and you also have people like, what we also realized with not only John Brown and Nat Turner was that John Brown and Nat Turner purported, or basically said, when they were caring about their own revolutions, or they were caring about their own rebellions, were saying that they were fueled by the Holy Spirit, essentially. And what really scared a lot of European Americans or white Americans at this time was that they believed at this time, and of course we saw this with slave Bibles, we saw this with a lot of different things. They believed that slavery was biblically accurate. They believed that slavery was something that was supported by the Bible and was supported by Christianity. But what we then saw was, we saw a group or a rising of people who were saying, not only is slavery morally incompatible with the ideals of this nation, but slavery is also morally incompatible with Christianity, which most of us would agree with. Obviously, it's, if you have a situation, especially when you have, for example, Exodus, when you have a large story of Moses setting his people free and parting the Red Sea, that is something that was not included in the slave Bible. However, what we would see later, and what many have touched on, was that Christianity and faith would become a centering point for Black Americans, not only in arguments against slavery, but also later on in terms of the civil rights movement. A lot of social change in the Black community has always been anchored in the Black church or Black faith. And that's what we really saw. And that was really what scared a lot of white Americans or white slave owners at this time, because white slave owners had interpreted slavery as something that they could use to justify. Had interpreted their religion as something that they could use to justify slavery. But enslaved Black people, free Black people, and also some other white Americans were saying, no, Christianity is something that does not justify slavery. It actually justifies revolt or rebellion against slavery. So that was something that also scared people. And that's why the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass is so important, because not only does it really show that faith, and it really does push the point home that Christianity does not support slavery, but it also shows that the humanity of Black people during this time. As we discussed last week, Black people were not viewed as human beings. Their humanity was not being assessed when we talked about their issues. So having this narrative of someone being enslaved for almost their entire life and escaping slavery and the traumas that came with it being publicized, being published, and being essentially read by almost the entirety of America, including white Americans, really started to move the hearts and minds of of especially white Americans around slavery. There was this there was this point essentially, especially with this book, that slavery was not something that could continue because it was not morally aligned with the philosophies and the founding principles of the United States government, nor was it morally aligned with the principles of Christianity. And then we have to talk about the next, and this is not really relating to how people would really view enslaved people, but this was really talking about how Black people started to organize socially and organize politically. And this is, and these are two texts, and you may be familiar with W.E.B. Du Bois, but the souls of Black folk, and specifically we'll be also be talking about the Talented Ten. But to summarize the souls of Black folk, the souls of Black folk talks about the Black American diaspora in the United States. And how exactly do you deal with living as someone who has been dehumanized and someone who has been essentially made to be a slave in a system and then being recently freed? And how do you live in that system? How do you get people to continue to see you as a human being or start to see you as a human being? And then we have the Talented Ten, or Talented Tenth, which you may be familiar with. And Du Bois was kind of known as the second side or the second face of what would be considering the new developing Black America, essentially. Du Bois was one who was really focused on Black America will succeed through our Talented Ten. So essentially, he was saying that the people who will lead Black America are the top 10 of Black American people. So it will be the doctors, the physicians, the professors, the lawyers, the people in the professions who are, the people who go to school for so and so years, and then the people who actually, do that work. However, I want to actually create a short little note since I said people who go to school for so and so years. It wasn't, if you're not familiar or not, processes like bar exams, law school, medical school, the MCAT exam were all processes actually created because to essentially back in the day, to become a lawyer, you would do your 4 years of college. You could do your 4 years of undergrad and essentially start practicing law and say you're a lawyer, and that's how you became a lawyer. However, as Black Americans started to be freed, or as African Americans started to become freed, there were many people who were obviously interested in becoming a part of the lawyer or attorney profession. It was something in which a lot of Black Americans gravitated towards because they could use the law to further prove that they should be on legal equal standing with everyone else in society. However, to prevent that, what a lot of people did, the creation of not only a requirement to go to law school, but the creation for a law school aptitude exam, as well as a aptitude exam to become a lawyer or a practicing attorney, had been created. So there was also, even within the idea of the Talented Tenth, there was also that barrier of entry that was starting to be created as a means to prevent those who were going into those fields. But also, alongside W.E.B. Du Bois, there was another conflicting idea. Like I said, there were two faces of Black America. There was Du Bois' idea of Black America being upheld by those who were in the professions, by lawyers, doctors, etc. But there was also this idea that Black America should be upheld by those who were skilled in the trades, the masons, the factory workers, the carpenters, those who worked with their hands. That's who Black America should be upheld by, essentially the other 90%. And that idea was held primarily not by W.E.B. Du Bois, mainly because W.E.B. Du Bois was very much in the academic sphere. He was someone who was, like I said, he was a graduate of Harvard, and he was someone who was of that Talented Tenth. However, the issue was, because of limits and barriers to education, what we saw was that the Talented Tenth idea, as much as Black Americans were talented enough to get into those fields, they were often not allowed to get into those fields. So There was another face who you may be familiar with. There was Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington is most famous for establishing the Tuskegee Institute. And the Tuskegee Institute started as a way, or as what we would now know as technical universities. These were not universities like Harvard or Yale that were focused on the classics or literature or what we call theoretical things or getting people into professions. These were institutes or institutes of education that were focused on getting people to work with their hands, to be in the trades, of teaching people a hard skill, as we would say. And Booker T. Washington had the idea that no, and not what Dubois is wrong in saying that Black Americans will be held up by the doctors and lawyers of the world. He actually insisted that Black America would be held up by those who work with their hands, the carpenters, the plumbers, all those types of different people. So what we see and what we still see today is that there is this conflict, or there's this kind of two-faced ideal to this day of how exactly do we continue to move as a united force. But as I kind of discuss political motivations as well as how Black America is starting to develop politically, I also wanted to touch more on the Civil War as well and talk about exactly how slavery was really established, or slavery was de-established within the nation from a legal perspective. So, as you may be familiar with, and like I said, we weren't really going to discuss more of what the battles are happening, but we were talking about how exactly what was going on in Black America that affected and what caused the Civil War and what happened after the Civil War. So, as we may or may not be familiar with, the ending of slavery and essentially the cessation of slavery basically starts with the Emancipation Proclamation, and then as we now know as Juneteenth, or June 19th, in 1865, we have Abraham Lincoln sends down troops to free the remaining slaves who were still under bondage in Galveston, Texas. And what we then see is, or what we are then told is, well, after 1865, no one was ever enslaved again. No one was ever in such a situation ever again, which legally and on the books is technically true. However, as I said before, there are things that we also need to take note of in terms of what happens. So the main thing that we also need to take note of is not the Emancipation Proclamation, but the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment was the amendment that abolished slavery in all but one case. And the 13th Amendment basically says that slavery is abolished on every single legal play field within the United States. However, it is not abolished in the case if you are imprisoned or basically you're serving jail time. So the problem arises when you have basically a bunch of people who were previously enslaved who could not find jobs. And then what happens in the South, or what happens in other states during this time, there are things called vagrancy laws that were passed. So then it was, if someone doesn't have a job or has been living on a plantation for the last couple of years, and the vagrancy laws are passed in which it's illegal to sleep in public, or it's even illegal to not have a job or to be employed, then the main people who are being targeted by those jobs are Black American people or formerly enslaved people. Therefore, you have a lot of formerly enslaved people being arrested via vagrancy laws, and then you have a situation in which all of a sudden now you're having Black people be arrested and being put back into the chains of slavery because they were arrested via vagrancy laws. So now, yes, slavery is now technically illegal. However, because the one part of slavery that is now legal is that you can technically still be enslaved if you're in prison, becomes a big issue. And this continues to be a big issue even till today, in which that clause of the 13th Amendment is still valid. If you are arrested, or if you have been arrested, or you're actively serving in prison, an individual, who may be imprisoning you. And might I remind you, the United States prison system is not fully run by the United States government. There are also what we call private prisons. There are corporations that basically run prisons as well. So whoever is currently imprisoning you, or whoever basically has right to your sentence, has also the ability to make you work for free. And this was shown with vagrancy laws, and this is very much all the way up to today. And then the other issue is, and some of you may be familiar, was there was a sharecropper system in which, yes, you were technically not enslaved, but you were working on possibly the same plantation you've been working on, even if you were previously enslaved, or you were even working for, there were situations in which slave owners were claiming that formerly enslaved people owed debt previously while not working. So there was a situation in which if people were not being arrested and forced to basically be enslaved people in prisons, there were also situations in which you have people actively being sharecroppers. And sharecroppers basically lived on the land and were paid very minimal amounts. And it was basically they were being paid the minimal amount to not be legally considered enslaved. And sharecropping goes on late into the 1970s. Not, I would say, like I said, this is only 50 years ago, where people were still doing this practice of very, very low compensated labor, in which was very much similar to the same system of slavery. They were living on the plantation, or they were living on the facility. They were being paid low to no wages, and in some cases, they were subject to violence. How do we know this exactly? Not only are there reports of this still happening, of that happening in the South up to the 1970s, but myself personally, I do know that this happened in the 1970s, as my grandmother was a sharecropper, and her great-grandmother and great-grandfather were sharecroppers during that time. So when we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, and when we talk about the 13th Amendment, we also do have to realize that there were also what we would call loopholes, or legal loopholes, that allowed for slavery to persist all the way up to the 1970s. There were situations in which people were either indebted to their previous slave owners and still had to do work, or there were people who were arrested for little to no reason and were being enslaved in prisons. And the other thing that we have to look at as well to end is the Civil War also legally shook up the country, because not only did it from a legal perspective in slavery, but it also shook up the country because the 14th Amendment, the amendment that would come right after the 13th Amendment, would give Black American people citizenship. And the 14th Amendment essentially settled the ground for what we now call as birthright citizenship. The argument around the 14th Amendment, or birthright citizenship, specifically for Black Americans at the time, but this is extended to other groups as well, was that because the majority of descendants of enslaved people, or the majority of Black Americans at the time that the 14th Amendment was passed, were born in the country, the argument was that all these people must become citizens. And what we saw was, overnight, the population of essentially every single Black person, freed, enslaved or not, became a citizen. And that essentially laid the ground for, like I said, equal protection in this country. It laid the ground for multiple immigration rights issues in this country. And it laid the ground for so many different fights in this country. And the 14th Amendment, I would say, from a legal perspective, is probably the most sought after precedent when it comes to whether the Supreme Court or other laws as well. It has not only been a foundation for Black Americans and their rights in this country, but as we are kind of going through these issues now, it has also been a topic of discussion when it comes to further immigration rights and immigration issues in this country as well. As we are at 5 o'clock, and I said that I wanted to cut it down to an hour because of the Super Bowl, does anyone have any questions and or comments as we end out and close out this week? I will take that as a no so far. However, I will further discuss, as we did last week, of um, what to look out for our next lesson. So for our next module, we'll really be talking about, this is probably going to be the longest one because we're talking about a lot of different things in 1 week. And this class may run to that 1 hour and 30 minutes mark. But week 3 is the Great Migration, and this is directly as a cause of Southern Reconstruction, as we talked about. Black California settlement. So we'll be talking exactly of how some of our ancestors came to California and even how they came to Redlands. Black Americans during World War One. So we didn't really talk about it much, but we'll talk about during World War One. So this is around the start of the NAACP. Black Americans during World War Two, so their service in the war. During the Cold War as well. So this is during the 1950s, 60s, well, the 40s to the 90s, essentially. And what we really are talking about here is we're talking about how exactly Black Americans navigated political issues here as well as abroad. So we're talking about the Vietnam War, we're talking about the Korean War, we're talking about the rise and fall of communism. And then we're also going to discuss, and it's not there, but it was just automatically going to be there because it's along with what was going on during the Cold War. We're going to be talking about the Civil Rights Movement because obviously if this is a Black American history course, we have to talk about the Civil Rights Movement. But that's what we'll be discussing next week. But I will hopefully I will get it out earlier, but I will do the same, in which we will be sending messages and or just basic information that we can talk about for next week's module. All right, thank you so much.